Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm not going to introduce Lora, but I am Cheryl Kubiak from the Department of Social Work and the Research Consortium on Gender-Based Violence, and I'm really happy that you're here. And I want to introduce Monica Janer. And Monica is going to introduce Lora, but I want to tell you a little bit about Monica before. Monica is currently an activist around criminal justice reform, as well as a practitioner who is vigilantly helping those who are re-entering the community in the greater Lansing area. Prior to that, and what's most salient about her introducing Lora, is that Monica spent 28 years inside the women's facility as a lifer. She was finally released after those 28 years through a landmark case. But she credits Lora and bringing education back into the women's facility for all of the gains that she's made, and they've been many. She's on the Community Corrections Board for Greater Lansing. She's doing a Ban the Box effort. So she's been a real support in the community, including holding up her brother's bookstore.
Right.
So she will have a book signing where the books will be available after the talk. So, Monica.
Oh, thank you. Well, she already stole a lot of my thunder here, but yeah, I did do 28 years in prison. And I was one of these women that is in this book. And while Lora did a great job of bringing the human side, it is so important because these people are defined by their worst mistake, and it's just not fair because they're actually really good people. The majority of them would do absolutely wonderful, like I would, and like I'm doing out here, if they were given the opportunity. And it's really important for me to change the perception about the people that are serving life sentences that were there, because most of them got caught up because of a man, because of their husband, because of something, somebody else. They didn't actually do any killing. They were just an aider and abetter. And don't think that I'm taking consequences away, because they did need to serve consequences. But most of them have done like 25 years. So I'm going to let Lora tell you about the wonderful book that she's written and how much she's learned about the people that I had to leave behind and that I worked really hard to help get out here with me. Lora?
So I have a number of things I want to say before I start with all this, and the first is that I did my undergraduate here. And it is so much fun to come back and see how much it's grown. I lived in Yakeley, which I don't know if that's still a residence hall now, or is it, yeah, so I was an RA for a while. And this was like the time when women still had hours. We were so stupid. I mean, the men didn't have hours and we did, and we thought that was okay. Well, it takes a while to mature out of that. And so I want to thank, from the deepest part of my heart, the Department of Social Work, Criminal Justice, the Research Consortium on Gender-Based Violence, and the Center for Gender in a Global Context for pooling their resources to bring me here. It's such an honor for me to be back here and to be able to talk to you about this. I was in the facility on Saturday giving the women each a copy of this, so our joke that night, Monica, was that the whole place is going to be really quiet tonight because everybody wanted to get back and read about themselves. But I also want to tell you what an incredible role model Monica is for not just the women inside, but for all of us. She came out with nothing and has built an entire life. She is mentioned in the book, not by name, but as a role model for the women inside who saw her as not walking away from them when she got out, not turning her back on them, but working actively for them and for men who are imprisoned in the state. And working, are you still chairing the Ban the Box?
Yeah.
Yeah, so she's the state chair for the Ban the Box initiative, which is no mean feat, let me tell you. So kudos to Monica.
Kudos to you.
So let me talk about this book now and tell you what I found and try to get you thinking beyond the kind of media conceptions of who's inside, particularly women. So I call it eating the life sentence elephant because there were lots of women who said what Sierra Blue said, which is a life sentence can kill you. You can't do it all at one time. You have to take it in bits and pieces. You have to do it one day at a time. Now, Sierra Blue is not her real name. All the women chose their own pseudonyms. So every time they're quoted, their words are there, the pseudonyms are the ones that they chose. So here's what I'm going to do for you in this talk, I hope. I'm going to give you the context of women's criminalization. I'm going to give you the context of women's imprisonment. And then I'm going to talk about the theoretical typology that I developed in terms of how do women inside create meaningful lives when this is the only life you have. And then we'll have Q&A. So I'm going to ask you to take notes on what you want to ask me about, and then in the Q&A we can do deeper responses than if we do it while I'm trying to get through this. So let me start with the information that 1/3 of all the incarcerated women in the world are incarcerated in US prisons. 1/3 of all the women in the world are right here. Men constitute about 93% of the US prison population, but the number of women who are under state and federal criminal processing authority is the fastest growing segment of the US prison population. So between 1980 and 2010 was the year that I started gathering data, the population of incarcerated women had increased 646%. Now I want you to hold on to that number, 646%. I mean, that's insane. In 2011, there were more than 1,400,000 women under criminal processing authority, under their supervision. So they were on probation, or they were on parole, or they were incarcerated, or they were subject to other forms of control, like tethering, which still keeps them under the control of the system. So with those kinds of increases, we have to ask ourselves, what's going on here? What's happening? Prison populations, both male and female, have been increasing for almost 4 decades, while crime rates have fluctuated without response or without apparent relationship to the extensions of imprisonment. So what we see is imprisonment rates in almost a straight line trajectory going up, while criminal rates are, with some blips, essentially going down. They make an X. The dramatic increases in female imprisonment, that 646%, has not been a response to more violent female criminality. It has not. Media constructions would want us to believe that, but in fact, women's share of violent crime has remained more or less steady for the last 40 years. Okay. All right, so what we're looking at here is what Samuel Walker calls an imprisonment orgy. Something else is going on. Maida Chesney-Lynn and Lisa Pascoe, both criminologists, argue that longer sentences for women reflect a criminal processing fervor to treat men and women equally, what they call equality with a vengeance, because women have an asymmetrical involvement in criminal activity. Other researchers attribute longer sentences to women's economic marginalization and their limited avenues for survival, and to changes in the system resulting in more punitive responses to women's involvement in drug-related crimes. The government's war on drug has been a war on women of color. It has increased the rates of imprisonment for women engaged in low levels of the drug trade. So the drug market is skewed the same way the labor market is skewed. At the upper ranges of the illegal drug market, you have solidly male management. Some women in the mid-levels, but primarily women are at the lower levels and they're street sellers. So if you're selling 5 nickel bags of Coke on the street, you're needing to sell a whole lot of bags of Coke to make any money, and you're gonna come to the attention of the criminal processing system. If you're dropping off a $10,000 bag in Bloomfield Hills once a month, nobody's even gonna know you're there. And so you're not going to be under the attention of the police and the judicial system. So the drug focus is also part of what other researchers called widening the net. That is reframing behaviors that were formerly adjudicated as misdemeanors and now adjudicating them as felonies. So that kind of thing is like shoplifting at the lower levels is a misdemeanor. If you shoplift X amount of money, it becomes a felony, and then you do prison time. So this kind of changes in the legislative expansions of what constitutes an offense leading to a parole ineligible life sentence, what we call LWOP, life without parole. So there's this wide range of habitual offender laws that focus more on the persistence of criminality than on the severity of the crimes. Things like 3 strikes, right? So you can do a life term in a 3-strike state for 3 shoplifting terms. 3 felonies and you're doing life. Other push factors include things like mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws, restrictions on good time, and here's where we all need to be held accountable. A punitive public attitude that results in this imprisonment orgy that has disproportionately affected women. Do the crime, do the time. And when you support that kind of simplistic thinking, you're supporting that punitive attitude. Now, in 2009, there were 4,694 women serving life sentences in the US. 28.4% of them were serving life without parole, LWOP sentences. Of those, 176 were female juveniles sentenced to life imprisonment. These LWOP sentences, life without parole, reflect a loss of confidence in personal reformation in favor of retribution and vengeance. They also reject social science, medical, behavioral science research that demonstrates clearly that individuals, even those who commit serious crimes, mature out of criminal behavior. Now, in Michigan in 2010, the year and the site of my data collection, there were 176 women of all ages incarcerated for life. 72 of those women participated in the study. I invited all 176 of them to participate. What some of them told me afterwards was, and this was a research error on my part, I had addressed the initial letter to them, dear female lifer, because I couldn't do individual ones, and that offended some of the women because they didn't want to be reminded of their life sentences. Other women chose not to participate because they were afraid that I would make prison sound like it was okay. Like it's, kind of hard, but you can manage it and you can do it. Other women couldn't participate because of medical reasons. 85 initially responded, and then we lost some people for programmatic reasons or for medical reasons. So I ended up with 72. And I want to talk about a life sentence in terms of what Liberty Flynn says. We weren't given death sentences, but we're treated like we're already dead by society, the justice system, and MDOC, the Michigan Department of Corrections. A life sentence is a condition of social invisibility, isolation, and desolation. Imprisonment is a damaging experience, particularly for women, resulting from the continuous process of erosion that goes on. The slow wearing away of self, of social value, of autonomy, and of agency through the daily assaults of institutional control and surveillance. A life sentence creates cemeteries of the living. So those of you who have never been in prison, this just kind of will orient you. So I want you to think about how you would be and who you would be in this context. What royalty says is, this is the lowest you can get besides death. So when you have a life sentence, every day is the same day for the rest of your life. 20, 40, 60, 80 years. For juvenile lifers, clearly 70 years. Every day is the same. I don't know if any of you saw that movie, The Groundhog Day, where, you know, they were having fun and it was every day. This is like every day of the same thing. You are under 24/7 surveillance. Everywhere you go, everything you do, everyone you see, everything you eat, the entire action of your life is under constant surveillance by officers, and in this facility by 1,400 cameras. Your life is routinized by counts, which occur 4 times a day, and count. You know, the facility has to count and make sure nobody's escaped. So you must be sitting on your bunk at count. If you are standing in your cell at count, you are out of place, and you can get a ticket for that. So you have to be on your bed for those 4. Chow 3 times a day. Work, which is work of the facility that keeps the facility running. So clerks, cleaning, maintenance, porters, if you can get work, because this is a small community and there isn't work for everyone. Visits might interrupt your day, but they only happen on prescribed days at prescribed times if your friends and family can afford to come. And you share a 10 by 8 living space with someone who is assigned to you. So the 2 of you are going to live together, and the 2 of you, and the 2 of you, and the 2 of you. And too bad if you don't like each other. That's tough. You're going to live together. You have no choice in bunkie selection. When I was teaching my course at UM Dearborn, I would offer people as an extra credit opportunity to spend a weekend in their bathroom, because that is the size of a traditional cell inside the women's prison, and you would be sharing that with somebody else. Okay, so given all this, and given that I was the co-sponsor of the National Lifers for a while, so I knew a lot of these women before and was so impressed by them that always running through my head was this question: how do women who are sentenced to life imprisonment create meaningful lives inside? Because of course they do, and I saw them do it. And so what resources do they draw on? What is it they use? And so when I started this book, Destiny said, and she chose to participate, you're going to show the world who we really are. You're telling our story in ways we could never do. You're giving the outside world a chance to see us as mothers, daughters, and sisters, the way they identify themselves, not the way the media identifies them. So, life-serving women are a small population of the prison population. They're numerically small, but they're a significant segment of imprisoned people. And here's something I want you to think about with that 646%. Maleness and masculine gender are taken for granted in the criminal processing system. Most criminal processing books are geared towards men, as are the penal codes, as are sentencing guidelines, as are correctional opportunities and programs. Officials at every level of the criminal processing system are overwhelmingly male. And the voices of imprisoned men and women in many instances have been forgotten, marginalized, or simply ignored. With the consequence that, and John Irwin said, John was himself incarcerated before he became a criminological scholar, and he says, quote, "The prisoner voice remains largely unrecognized and relatively inaudible," end quote. So I think it's important to examine how life-serving women themselves live and perceive their lives. And what I found that women serving no-exit sentences are actively engaged in developing life-affirming strategies for doing life. They value and promote images of self-control and participation. They present themselves as rational, responsible agents interacting with one another and with the officers who guard them, and therefore as shaping their daily lives within the constraints of imprisonment. So how do they do it? The short answer is what Destiny says. You can't stop. When you stop, it's hopeless and you want to die. So part of the practice is to just keep busy. Individually and collectively, life-serving women develop coping and resistance strategies that disrupt routine practices and correctional ideologies. They are active in formulating ways to identify and define the problems they face, to reconstruct their spoiled identities, and in developing strategies that contest the erosions of prison life. So that's kind of the short answer to that question. The long answer is that life-serving women manifest the link between lived experience, experiential knowledge, and criminal processing power. We can understand their incarcerations as a function of societal definitions of deviance and conformity, gender, and punishment, all of which are characterized in their life sentences by paradox, irony, and contradiction. Their accounts were delivered in focus group participation, life course interviews, and solicited diaries. And they interrupt the popular cultural narratives of life-serving women as some kind of aberrant female monsters. And they reinstate them in their humanity as women who have made serious, life-altering errors of judgment. I'm happy to talk about the methodology, but I'd like to do that in the Q&A if you have questions about that, and just want to move on to the analysis here. And that's the next slide. There it goes. Okay, so conventionally people assume that if you have a life sentence, it's because you took a life, either in a murder or in a homicide. But in Michigan, sentences of life can be meted out for any of these crimes. I'm not going to read them all, but I do want to just note things like carjacking, unarmed robbery, bank robbery, safe breaking, assault with intent to murder, assault to intent to rob while armed, perjury in court proceedings of capital crime. All of these are life without parole sentences in Michigan. And Michigan is one of only 13 states that have no lower age limit for life sentences without possibility of parole. So in this state, children as young as 8, 10, 12, or 14 years old could theoretically be given a life sentence. What this demonstrates, among other things, is what I earlier called widening the net. Right, that more things now can be seen as life without parole sorts of events. Okay, let me talk about the research participants. At the initiation of the study, The 72 women who participated had collectively already served a total of 1,088 years in prison. Of the 72 respondents, 13% had participated in killing their abusive husbands or partners, sometimes as the doers and sometimes as conspirators, often after years of unrelenting assault. The act of killing is really extraordinary, but in all other ways, most women who kill are very ordinary. For those women who are the primary offenders, most often murder was their first and only criminal offense. So let me illustrate for you what happens when a woman who has been in an abusive relationship. Of course, all of those doing gender violence work already know this. But a woman who has been in an abusive situation, this time she knows this is it. He's going to kill me. He's going to kill me today. Today, tonight, whatever. And somewhere during the course of getting beat up, he gets exhausted and he passes out. Her head is still in that space where he's going to kill me. And so she kills him. She shoots him, or she hits him with something, or she stabs him. And she immediately calls the police and says, "Oh my God, I just killed my husband." So they have her confessing to murder. Then the police arrive and they say, "Have you been thinking about this for a long time?" She goes, "Oh my God, it's been years." So now they have her for premeditation. And so what we know is that women who kill their partners do life. Statistically, men who kill their partners do years. They get out. Because, and you read it in the paper all the time, he's standing there with a gun and he's got gun residue all over his hand. And somebody broke in the house, I don't know who he was, the bushy-haired stranger, and I had to defend her and the gun went off and I don't know what happened. And so he does years, she does life. Now, when the focus is on the women's flaws and weaknesses and not on the social forces that underscore the crime, women who kill become the monsters of public lore. However, when their deeds are contextualized and the criminal actions are demystified by understanding the details of their lives, their disorganized childhoods, the sexual abuse and physical trauma they have endured, and we know over 85% of women incarcerated in this country have been sexually or physically violated in the years before they came to prison. Delinquent peers, violent relationships. So when we contextualize their choices, you can see that they lose the sensational qualities, and much of the onus then shifts to society's failure to provide relief to women who are trapped in intolerable situations. They are often not assisted by institutional powers in their pre-incarceration lives, but they experience the full force of the law when they take action. So, the average time served by the women in this study was a little over 15 years per person. The shortest period of time down, that is time that they have already been in prison, was 1 year. The longest was 36 years. At the time of the sentencing, the women in the study ranged from juveniles who were age 16 to mature women who were 51. Although the average time, their average age at the time of the crime was 29. 22% of these women had spent more time incarcerated than they had lived as children or young women in the free world. So I want to talk a bit about their agency. And when I talk about agency, I'm talking about the choice to act autonomously, to make your own choices, to not always be stimulus response. So what Lauren says is prison is a social world. It is its own society. And they have to live within that society. So the study participants are in constant dialogue with the institution as they challenge institutional power by appealing to general notions of humanity. Although their responses are constrained by institutional policies and procedures do not consistently determine their responses. Women act with agency whenever they can. So that action is not always visible materially or recognizable in institutional terms. Sometimes the women's resistance and self-determination appears passive, as when they work to keep their minds active through reading or developing expertise on correctional policies, or researching their cases in the law library. Sometimes they employ ruses and protests to fill an institutional gap. And sometimes they form groups, write letters, or engage in confrontation. Pardon me. Their agency can be understood, I think, as a dialectical relationship between the imprisoned women and the representatives of institutional control. Study participants both overtly and covertly report preserving their ability to negotiate power and to resist penal oppressions. These women who are disempowered and vulnerable institutionally act and negotiate power despite their subordination and confinement. Their acts of agency, consequently, I think, affect and sometimes challenge the institutional culture. There is an identifiable order to coping in this environment that results from a series of causes and effects. And it results in what I think is a discernible pattern that can be understood and predicted by examining the sequences that produce them. So let me show you what this typology looks like. Don't look at this yet. Just listen to this part. Okay, locked in, locked up, and constantly surveilled. The study respondents had limited opportunities for self-determination, but they were never completely without agency, even if the choice available to them was simply to refuse compliance with an order. Their movement through the identified states of the stages reflected their capacities to resist the erosions inherent in the environment and to become active in their own social transformations. So here's what I want to say about this type. I'll say a lot about it, but for right now. These are not fixed stages, but when you have to present some kind of visual form, you have to have squares and boxes and circles and stuff. And so what I've tried to do is demonstrate these two stages. The first two stages are stages that are common to all women who come into prison. Everybody becomes a prisoner in prison, and everybody has to learn to negotiate or navigate the mix. Beyond that, women who utilize agency and work to self-actualize move through these stages. But what I tried to do was not, they're analytical stages. So it isn't like you act at a choice point and then the next day you establish a counter-narrative and then you move to an internal compass. These stages are all embedded in one another, and that they're more toing and froing and pliable and permeable. And so I tried to demonstrate them in this graph as being embedded in one another. So what might happen, for example, is that you establish a counter-narrative to the prisoner, criminal, bad person. And what that means is that then you have to go back and negotiate again where you were in the mix or with whom you were in the mix, so that these are constantly in flux. So these two stages, the first two, as I said, are common to everyone, but they are amplified by the permanence and the material solidity of a life sentence. The women's self-actualizing processes are identified in this 6 stages. But let me remind you again, each is a constructed analytical category that reflects the women's choices as they manage and resist the conditions of their imprisonment. So they're not static phases, they're permeable. Because dealing with a life sentence expands and contracts women's personal, social, psychological, and emotional resources. All of the stages represent ongoing and sometimes circular, but continuously fluid processes. Doing time is never just one decision, one adjustment, one acceptance, or one rule. The processes sometimes overlap and are sometimes discrete. So, women who are incarcerated for life, even though every day is the same day, also face constant demands to readjust and to respond to changing institutional personnel or circumstances, and to negotiate power relations with correctional officers and with other women, and to find ways to define themselves both within and against the definitions implied in being imprisoned. So agency for life-serving women begins with becoming a prisoner, and it develops in navigating or negotiating the mix. Now, women who have years can just kind of choose to while away their time and just kind of waste time until they get out, because eventually they're going to get out and return to their pre-incarceration lives. Life-serving women cannot do that. Those lives are gone forever. So they have to make the best of their never-ending circumstances. So each of the ensuing stages, acting at a choice point, establishing a counter-narrative, developing an internal compass, and rebuilding social bonds, reflects their life-serving processes as they are involved in developing increasingly more agentic attitudes and behaviors. They move back and forth through these processes, feeling and being less agentic in the early stages than they are in the later stages, but at all times attempting to maintain some practice of self-determination and affirmation. Now, not all women move through all 6 stages, right? Some women become stuck in place. They get enmeshed in the erosions resulting from prison policies and practices. They get caught up and seduced by the allure of the mix. And some of them just have such serious maladaptive problem-solving choices that they can't move beyond them. Others move through the stages, as I said, in kind of a circular process of toing and froing as they develop self-actualizing perspectives. And then they revisit earlier understandings of themselves. Okay, so let's talk about the first 2 stages. And they're captured by Love Evans' statement, this place is not like Burger King. It's not have it your own way. And so what happens is that women have to learn how to be prisoners in prison. These 2 stages are the only ones that are not voluntarily assumed. These are assigned. They are imposed as a consequence of sentencing, where women become socially and legally defined as criminals and are remanded to prison. Women who have been agentic in the free world become prisoners in prison. They must learn to be inmates and to live in a culture and an environment that is defined by other people. Although becoming a prisoner is not a choice, As they do in all the ensuing phases, life-serving women respond to their new circumstances with some measure of self-determination. Confinement does not end agency. It shrinks it, but it doesn't end it. Their choices are imbricated with the strategies and tactics that they innovate and they develop, both collectively and idiosyncratically, to ward off the corrosive effects of a life sentence. So the primary task of the first stage is learning official prison rules. You have to learn the norms and you have to learn the culture. And for sure, you need to learn a deferent demeanor. Once they're taught the formal expectations of the institution, women are then assigned to general pop or general population, the less restrictive community of other incarcerated women. And in that stage, they have to develop the skills to navigate the mix. So they use the social world understandings that they developed in their previous life, but they have to thread their way through the highly sexualized environment of gossip, intimate relationships, power struggles, and the daily drama. In short, the informal norms of their new lives. Now, they begin the learning to be a prisoner in closed custody. The label and the assumption of the identity of prisoner, inmate, felon, criminal is thrust upon them in their arrival to the prison. Closed custody is 22 to 23 hour lockdown, and that begins every woman's orientation to prison. Confinement in closed custody lasts for months and may sometimes last for years. It is the site of coercive control strategies that orient new arrivals, whatever their sentence length, to the expectations of the system. The primary goal of this institutional socialization is to get the women into the routines of the institution, to get them to internalize those definitions and into their new identity. Upon arrival, newly sentenced woman is immediately stripped of any sense of herself. So Cindy says, when I got here, I lost who I was. And Ginger says, there's a lot of drama. It's intense. You're on lockdown 22 hours a day. In the outside world, you don't deal with people like that. It's a struggle every day. At its most basic level, becoming a prisoner seems pretty simple, right? It's a unidimensional identity. You're incarcerated, you're a prisoner of the state. It's an indisputable fact. But as Carleen Faith argues, and I quote, the label ignores processes of criminalization, namely the ways by which criminals are socially constructed and processed by the criminal justice system within a dynamic of power relations which determine sanctions against specific selected behaviors and populations. It implies a false and generally class-based dichotomy of good people, non-criminals, and bad people, criminals, end quote. Now, while incarceration itself is a difficult personal struggle, the receipt of a life sentence is an avalanche of erosions in which life-serving women are forced to face the confused uncertainty of a life of confinement. It took Sheila T. 5 or 6 years to work through the stages that were, quote, just like grieving, for me to come to terms and accept the reality of a life sentence in real time, end quote. The reality of the meaning of a life sentence is even more difficult to grasp for adolescent women who, as Sandy notes, quote, haven't even grown up yet, let alone learned how to survive in here, end quote. Juveniles incarcerated for life face triple jeopardy: imprisonment, immaturity, and a corrosive environment. Sentenced to prison at 17, Linda, now 42, has already spent 1.5 more lifetimes inside than she lived as a child before her incarceration. Nonetheless, she retains a strong sense of herself. Her agency is defined by outreach. She makes, and this is her quote, a special effort to educate newly sentenced juveniles. I don't think they understand the gravity of the situation, that a life sentence means the rest of your life, end quote, and that's Linda's emphasis. It's a difficult concept to comprehend. Comprehension that may be even more difficult for the children of life-serving women, and Lauren shared this story. Imagine having to explain what the rest of your life means to your child that you left when she was 5 and finds the courage to ask what it means at 18. It means that I will one day leave here in a box, honey. The piercing sobs that echoed through and silenced the visiting room still haunt me. She's 21 now. Most people don't think in terms of the full extent of their lives. They dream. They have expectations of a future that has possibilities and opportunities, perhaps limited, but not repetitiously so. They don't consider the future as being the same as the present over and over and over again. It's the meaning of a life bit that takes time to grasp. As Lauren told her daughter, life means until you die. At 16, 17, or even 18 years old, death is not an immediate future consideration. For most adolescents, realistically, it's 60 to 70 years away. That's more than 4 juvenile lifetimes. Too much for young women to grasp cognitively and emotionally. Yet they have to come to understand that their lives, as traditionally understood, are over. They have been decisively removed from conventional maturation and growth, from developing job skills, from love, marriage, and family building, from dancing, singing, and hanging out with friends, from voting, from learning to cook, garden, or paint, from walks in the woods or walks through the malls, from the sights and smells of daily living, and from all the social discourse that construct public lives. Now, let me address what the Supreme Court has done in the last 4 years with regard to juvenile lifers. So in 2012, they issued the Miller v. Alabama decision, which neither of these, let me say up front, are a get-out-of-jail-free card. Not quite. In Miller v. Alabama, what they said was mandatory assignment of life sentences to juveniles is unconstitutional because it is cruel and unusual punishment, because the brain development of juveniles is not sufficient to make appropriate decisions. They did not say juveniles could not get life sentences. They said they could not get them mandatorily assigned. But at the time, in 2012, they did not address the issue of those people who were sentenced pre-Miller. So it took them 4 years to get to that decision, and because it's got to work its way through the appeals court, and they have to disagree, and then. So in January of this year, in Montgomery v. Louisiana, they said, yes, absolutely, it's retroactive. So all those people, juveniles who were sentenced before, this does not mean that they automatically get resentencing hearings. This does not mean that they are let out for time served. And it does not mean that the parole board needs to let them out at all. What it does mean is that they have to be considered for parole. and that's on a 5-year cycle. So it's not a get out of jail free card, but it is the first hope that any of these juveniles have had about getting out. Let me caution you about the optimism of this, because what we've already seen in new sentencing is that states have assigned juveniles term, but the terms are 80 to 100-year sentences, which are essentially life sentences. I suspect that this will make its way through, probably in the next 20 years, through to the Supreme Court again, but it's going to take a long time. So that's the story with the Supremes. Back to the analysis. The institutional rules, pardon me, for becoming a prisoner, while they're enforced idiosyncratically, are learned in that hothouse of close custody. So in their first step out of the controlled environment, life-serving women learn that the next stage, navigating the mix, begins with assignment to general pop. Women who enter the arena of eased security restrictions start navigating this new context by paying very careful attention to what's close at hand and immediate. That is, the hypersexualized prison culture, the drugs, the loud talking, the profanity, the double bunking, the drama of relationships played out in public, and the perceived institutional disorder, which Shaketa Tasha Lynn claims is a shock to your system. They observe and come to understand the roles and statuses, the responsibilities and mores of the context. They learn the gendered rules inside, limit self-revelations, establish boundaries in sharing histories of abuse and victimization, learn to read the subtext of verbal exchanges, and ascertain who is a safe associate. Eventually, the women, like Joyce, stabilize and learn that other incarcerated women are not as scary as expected and are, in fact, women just like me who made bad decisions. Now, reportedly, 6 or 7 years into their bit, and this is a time that roughly corresponds to the final denials in the appeal process. And let me just do a short aside about appeals, because what you need to know is that appeals are not about guilt or innocence. You have already been adjudicated as guilty and you're done with that. The appeals are all about the technicalities of the conduct of your sentencing. So did the judge give appropriate instructions to the jury? Did your defense attorney represent you appropriately? Were you adequately represented? Things like that are what the appeals are about. They are not about your guilt or innocence. So you can sometimes hear, somebody's thrown away because they've exhausted all their appeals. Well, that implies that nobody believes you're innocent. But the appeals are not about your innocence or your guilt. So roughly 6 or 7 years, and it takes that long to do these appeals. And sparked by other circumstances in the facility itself or in their own lives that require self-inquiry, many of the life-serving women found themselves at the next stage, which I call acting at a choice point. This stage marks the moment when they choose to become deliberately proactive through self-reflection and through resistance in response to their imprisonment and its personal and social attritions. So they begin deliberate journeys of self-discovery and autonomy and resistance to the erosions that they're already feeling in this hidden world. So Lauren says, and I quote, "A shift occurred in me about 6 or 7 years into my bid. She quit smoking, stopped getting high, began to work out like a maniac, and started, quote, a relationship with God," end quote. Lauren also developed a political analysis of the injustices around her, and she began, quote, having conversations about situations, end quote. She was committed to the lifer mantra, which is, I'm going to do this time, not let this time do me. Lauren began to work collectively for change, noting that, and this is her quote, when I changed, the conversation changed. Now, throughout these formative stages, female lifers report being on their own in life skills creation and in intellectual development. That is, without institutional support to handle emotional responses, generate intellectual interest, because they're both part and not part of prison life. Martha says, for example, my hardest thing is whether I have to be here forever or not. I try not to focus on it. I try to keep myself busy so I don't think about it. And Carrie struggles, as she notes, that a lot of people just think we're cracked to society. Often, life-serving women are not permitted by prison personnel to enroll in programs that are designed for women who are returning to the real world. So they have been warehoused and implicitly defined as socially irrelevant, as crap to society. So as they wrestle through these stages, they learn to forgive themselves and to forgive those who have harmed them. They begin to develop the tolerance that is essential to survive inside, and to establish the conditions under which they can promote trust, as well as the empathy necessary to move beyond a focus on self to a sense of collective efficacy. Although they remain tethered to the mechanics of confinement, most of the respondents in the study describe embracing themselves and their life-serving peers as women with social value, who make contributions to individual and social welfare, and whose lives have meaning. And so you see that in this focus group dialogue, where I ask, are there women inside that you admire? Everyone, all of them. Yep, there's something that they have that can get you through. Everybody. Now, women who engage in these difficult processes come to envision a replacement self that supplants the spoiled identity of felon, criminal, inmate. Female lifers use their available resources, their life experiences, other women, prison programs, media, family, soap operas, TV evangelists, reading materials, and personal analyses to create alternative storylines, to tell themselves and others stories of resistance and forgiveness and circumscribed culpability. They create counter-narratives. Joyce, for example, clearly challenges the labels associated with her imprisoned location when she claims, my sentence is what I am, not who I am. And they begin to speak their truth to the power of the institution, as well as to the power of the prisoner, inmate, criminal labels that identify them. Now, the narratives that women construct are fluid and dynamic and are responsive to personal, community, and institutional changes. Some study respondents, for example, construct themselves as wiser women for whom it would be incongruous to commit, quote, something like that, the crimes for which they are imprisoned. Joyce exemplifies this frame in her succinct 14-word counter-narrative. The woman I am today mourns the girl I was when I did this. She presents herself as having matured beyond the angry young woman in the throes of graveyard love, a love about which her mother warned her, one of you is going to end up dead. 24 years later, Joyce characterizes herself as a responsible woman who prays for what anthropologist Lorna Rhodes eloquently describes as, and I quote, the possibility that the damage haunting the present can somehow redeem it, end quote. So in these counter narratives, one day, 1 hour, one irremediable act is not the sum total of a woman's personhood. Sheila T. asks rhetorically if it is fair to judge someone on a 5 to 10 minute period out of 80 years of their life. For all intents and purposes, that 5 to 10 minute period has become the defining measure of her life, but is not the totality of how she perceives and experiences herself or how she wants others to see her. The process of stabilizing this counter-narrative then overlaps and intersects with the next analytical stage, which is developing an internal compass. Now, life-serving women build on their counter-narratives to develop a core moral identity, which is both authentic for them and compatible with prison culture. Women formulate useful moral codes and beliefs that they define as authentic for the context. So, as Sasha Levin says, if you have no mind and no spine, you're easily led. Others develop perspectives that are profoundly subjective and that reflect the preeminence of the distinctiveness of prison rules over more conventional moral codes. Many women report developing what feminist philosophers call an ethic of care, or the dynamic of moral decision-making nested within both cooperation and community. For example, as her personal ethical belief, Sherry says, as long as what you're doing isn't hurting someone or coming back to hurt me, then she won't report the behavior to the officers. And she provides the example of stealing food from the chow hall, which she would not report, and stealing valuables from mail order, which she would report. A chow hall theft is absorbed by the institution. A mail order theft is the personal violation of a peer. Sherry's personal ethical belief unknowingly builds on the legacy of feminist philosophy scholars of ethics and is consistent with life as it is lived in a women's correctional facility. Now, although life-serving women may say, and they pretty much all say, I pretty much keep to myself. Doing time is a communal act. The act of doing time can appear singular and individual, as enshrined in the rhetoric of the inmate code, do your own time. Yet, it is actually way more complex than that. Imprisoned women traverse their solo journeys together. They do their own time together. They are constantly in public space while simultaneously removed from public view. So in these paradoxical conditions, they engage in efforts to cultivate their lives and to make them meaningful. These women who traverse the earlier stages of the self-actualization processes ultimately engage in collective efficacy, defined as the link between mutual trust and social cohesion among members of a collectivity, and their willingness to work together for the common good. The shift in life-serving women's locus of control is reflected in the opportunities that they generate to challenge the order imposed by rules and regulations. These women establish or actively participate in social networks, the collectives, with action orientations, the efficacy. Research and anecdotal stories establish lifers as stabilizing forces within the prison complex. As one of the women attests, we have to be. Their institutional safety depends as much on their behavior as on managing prison practices. Prison is their social universe for the long term. Maintaining order in that universe is a priority. Baby speaks to this stability when she says, "I'm doing life. I don't need that chaos. I've got to make the best out of what I have." As those women motivated to do so move through the deliberate personal processes of constructing their accounts in response to the master narratives of criminal and prisoners, they forge bonds of community and friendship to help one another survive. Every prison has a core of activists at any given time who assume leadership and become organizational and informational resources for other women. The life-sentenced women in this study who traverse the various stages of self-actualization are those activists. They are committed to building an understanding of the value of community and collective consciousness as resistance to the erosions of the prison environment. They actively engage other women in these processes through directed conversations, through social support, through daily acts of courtesy and recognition, through role modeling moral behavior and an ethic of care, through their own developing empathy and tolerance, and through the mentoring of juvenile lifers and others. They use the prison environment as scaffolding for the construction of life changes. They use opportunities and fissures in the system. They discard old habits. They engage others in the processes of crafting different ways of living as imprisoned women. They seek forgiveness of self and others through their behavior. As Joyce explained, "I wanted to prove to everyone that they were wrong to label her criminal and dismiss her for a single act. She cannot convince them verbally, so she attempts to demonstrate her integrity in the way she behaves and lives her life inside the walls." Life-serving women actively work to self-actualize within the limits of their carceral locations. Thank you. So now if you're not totally depressed, I'm happy to take questions or comments or... I know it's got to settle for a minute before you... It's okay. Yeah.
Laura, perhaps there are some students here from Inside Out, and I'm wondering, since Lora is kind of Michigan's mother to the Inside Out program, if maybe you would also entertain some questions or dialogue about that.
I'd be happy to do that. I'd be happy to do that. What would you like to know or hear? Yeah.
Yeah, so we're part of the Inside Out program. How did you come about starting it in Michigan?
Okay, I'm going to try to give you the Reader's Digest version of this, okay? So I had been the co-sponsor of Chapter 1014 of the National Lifers of America chapter at the Women's Facility. And we, in the course of that, began offering college-level courses to the women where we took one course and spread it out over a year, and then they got continuing ed units for completion of that course. And then I got bunches of my colleagues to come in and offer courses. And that program won the American Association of University Women Progress and Equity Award, and it came with a $5,000 honorarium. So I went back to the women and I said, "What do you want me to do with this money?" And I'm thinking, we'll have some big fancy dinner and bring in all the food they haven't had in years, and we'll buy stuff for the library, right? We'll really... And they said, and I mean, they said to me, and did this unanimously, take it to the men. Because there isn't a man in prison in this state who would have thought of the women. I guarantee it. But the women, understanding what Monica had said earlier, often come into prison behind a man because they don't get gender and they haven't thought about, the repercussions of their behavior on women. And the women wanted the men to be better when they came out. So then I trained in Inside Out and then brought it to, we were at Ryan then. And I didn't know that was all I had to do. I thought I had to do all this other stuff. So we started a theory group and then we decided this was too good a thing to keep to ourselves. And so then we had to, bring it out to other places. So now it's in 8 facilities in the state. And I understand that there are 3 new universities that are going to train people this summer and open up in at least 2 other facilities. So that was sort of the progress of it. Other people, Inside Out, this, you got a question in the back? Yeah.
Question, how do male lifers compare to women lifers? Are they doing the same self-actualization? Are they in there for more violent crimes? How do they compare?
I don't know, because I didn't study men, but I've done Inside Out with men for 10 years now. And so I can sort of tell you what I think. And yeah, they do self-actualize. I'm not sure they go through the same stages in the same way because I don't know how gender affects that so much. But yes, absolutely. They do sort of wake up and, it's like, oh, this is not working for me. How can I be better? And they work really hard at that. Often in the same way because they're also denied programming because they're lifers, so they got to figure it out themselves. So yeah, but I'll tell you the best line that came out of this research about the difference between men's facilities and women came from a woman who said, men make weapons, women make dildos. And so I'll leave you with that. You make what you can of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. It's really inspirational, both and the sharing of your methodology as well as your the findings that have come out so far. I had really one question about the mix.
Okay.
And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about this idea that it's a hypersexual culture, and like kind of what that means and looks like. Does it relate somehow to a disproportionate number of LGBTQ people who are already?
No.
Yeah, if you can
Has
say
nothing
more,
to
I'd
do with
appreciate
that.
it. Yeah.
Has absolutely nothing to do with that. Because the women's identity, even though they're frequently involved in same-sex intimacies, their identities are not, it's a situational problem. There are only women. And women, so in the book, let me tell you, I identify 11 means of using sex inside. Because it's, yeah.
I'm only in chapter 2, so
Okay,
thank
well,
you.
here we are, page 209.
Okay, I'll get there.
So I'll just read you what the 11 are and then I'll tell you what they are. So the first is just entry sex, trying to fit into the environment as it exists when you come in. The second one is kind of sex for sex sake. And so one of the women says, I didn't have a prom outside, I'm having my prom inside. I'm just gonna have sex because that's what I'm gonna do. Third is diversionary or distraction sex. And this is what some people call gay for the stay. You're there, you don't want to be without nurturance and care and love and whatever. Fourth is emotional fulfillment and personal growth, so that the partnership is the same as a partnership on the outside where you have love and trust and people support you. The fifth is bed buddies, and this is you're stuck in this unit and your girlfriend's in that unit and you just don't want to sleep alone, so you might have somebody in here. 6 is transactional sex, so I'm going to have sex with you because I want to get more noodles, which is the gold standard inside. You get those ramen noodles, and so you got a lot and I don't have any. 7 is predatory sex, and that certainly exists And what happens is that older women target younger new people inside, and they start giving them things like, you need more soap, or I'll give you some noodles, or whatever. And the payback, you can call in, and if I don't have the stuff to give back to you, then you can call it in sex. Some do it, the 8th one is autonomy. So women have sex because they want to define for themselves. It's part of the resistance to the erosion. I'm going to have sex because I want to have sex, and it defines me. 9th is gay on the outside, gay on the inside. So that would be the lesbian or bi community. 10 was committed couples, and there certainly are committed couples inside. Some that form, most that form inside. I'm trying to think. Do you know any that formed outside and came in together? No, I don't either. Did you?
No.
No, they form inside.
Well, actually, yeah, in the very beginning I did, there was a couple.
Oh,
But that was like 30 years ago, so.
yeah. They still there?
No.
Oh, thank God. And then the last is celibacy and autoeroticism. So people just either, for whatever reason, choose not to participate and handle their own sexual needs that way. So and I make a real argument here that it isn't that kind of definition of gay or straight just is not applicable in this site at all. Because you can engage in same-sex intimacy out of any of those number of reasons, but not identify yourself. And so one woman said, I had a girlfriend, but I'm not gay. And that was a common refrain. So, yeah, so that's what I was talking about in the hypersexualized environment. And one of the women said, it goes on so much, it's like those third world pictures of people with flies on their faces. You don't even bother to bat it away anymore. You just don't even notice it.
I was interested also because of this, since their bodies are supposed to be under such close control, that to label it as a hypersexualized culture.
Right.
Nonetheless, like that's just.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I just wanted to know more, so.
that women's sexuality is surveilled much more than men's sexuality in prison. I mean, and I know that to be a case in terms of the comparison between men and women's facilities. But that doesn't keep it from happening. And I include the strategies they identified for me to get around all of that. Where there is a will, there is a way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Because I want to study law later down the line, hopefully this kind of struck my interest, and I was very curious about it. So going back to the 13% of women that had killed their husbands and such, these women have been put through violence. They've been dehumanized and all these other things. Can't they use it as a way of self-defense kind of thing?
Well, they certainly try.
It just doesn't.
No, you've already confessed. I killed my husband. It's hard to make that argument. Certainly women do, and not everyone gets confined for a life sentence. I mean, some women do get off there. You can establish self-defense, but mostly not. Mostly not, because the law says that you can use equal force, but once you pick up a weapon, that is not equal force. And then you lose your self-defense argument, even if you're 5'2" and he's 6'10". Equal forces that you fight each other out. It's a male model of what self-defense looks like. And so as soon as you pick up a weapon, it's no longer equal force. Go get him, girl.
Right, I was going to say, to add to that, there was a big article in Lansing State Journal yesterday about a woman that's serving first-degree life for battered women. And one of the big problems with the women with the battered syndrome is they won't let them bring the evidence of that what was going on in the relationship. So it's really failed the women in that. And part of what she's trying to do by putting that article in the paper is to let people see that they're not getting a fair shake. When men do it and it's a self-defense, it works for them because of the instructions, but when the woman brings in the battered women and they've been beaten all this time, it's not working. So, it's a big issue. If you can get your hands on that article yesterday, it was really a good.
In the Lansing Journal.
Lansing State Journal. I don't know where else it went to, but I know she's not from Lansing, so I didn't.
Birmingham.
Yeah, I didn't understand why she was in the Lansing State Journal. I'm going to find out, but it was a great article.
Yeah.
I have a question. I happen to have watched a documentary, Eileen
Warnocky. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just made me
Monster.
think last night because I have done a lot of work with other populations where I see that many of the people seem really incapable, and I don't want to define it because really, we're not into defining, but did you find women there that were in the system that just, you could tell that they just did not have the ability to even circumnavigate or understand
To be on the outside.
why they were there?
Yeah,
Tell them
Eileen
whatever.
Warnocky's case is one of the ones that comes up all the time because she's one of the few female serial killers.
But yeah, and just seeing her in a video though, I mean, she was obviously, but I'm wondering because we don't always look at those things when we judge.
Well, so here's my response. I'm one of those people that would like to see prisons abolished, but not entirely, because there are probably 3 to 5% of the people in prison who should never hit the streets.
Agreed.
And so I don't want to see prisons gone entirely, but I think we should subscribe to we should make bumper stickers out of this. Texas state senator said, we should be incarcerating the people we're afraid of, not the ones we're mad at. And if we did that, we would reduce our prison populations and still maintain safety in the society. Because there are lots of things you can do with people you're mad at besides lock them up. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
For that 3 to 5% of people you talk about that shouldn't hit the streets,
Right.
do you think there should be any reform for them though? Obviously they shouldn't be on the streets, I guess, but our prison system's so dehumanizing, even for those people. I think that I personally think there should be rehabilitation somehow, even if they can't make it back out.
Right, yes, absolutely. I think we should be treating everybody with humanity and respect. And that prisons should be able to do that.
I mean, I hear about a couple other countries that do it a little bit differently, but how do you think that would look?
Well, I think that officers would not be guards, they would be counselors.
Yeah.
And that would make a huge difference in everybody's lives. And the last chapter in this book, the women come up with some of their own solutions, some tinkering with the system, some wanting and gender training. I mean, if you're gonna be incarcerating women, you need to have some kind of gender sensitivity or understanding that women do it differently. Yeah, I totally agree with you. There was another,
With respect, going back to the article that was in the journal, Veronica, and for anybody who's going to look it up, I was really interested in that woman's reaction to her fellow prisoners and how much distance she was trying to put between herself and them. And
She does.
yeah, and she said, she didn't like teaching or tutoring because she felt that the women were jealous of her education and so forth. So it was just a different take on reactions to the navigating the mix.
right.
Well, and so I was talking yesterday when I was at the store, and people were coming in and talking about that article, and we were sharing that, and every person that came to me said, well, how dare she say, I don't want to have people in my business, but here she is putting an article in the paper, So I heard that yesterday like 5 or 6 times, so it's real interesting how people perceive, whatever's in the paper. So yeah, it was interesting.
One of the things about that is that women who come into prison who have some kind of social savvy on the outside. You've had some kind of social power. You were a teacher or, God forbid, a professor. And you go in and all of a sudden you're put in this environment where you have to be deferent to people who, can't spell their names. And, it's a real struggle. So she has the whole, we both know her well.
Right.
So she has the whole time, she's tutoring in a class with someone who is teaching the class who doesn't have the degrees or the savvy that she does, and she's like the tutor.
Yeah.
And
Well,
she struggled with that for
A
a
long
long
time,
time. Yeah.
She seemed to like the guards and the officers better than she liked the.
Well, and the women actually look at her, she thinks she's better than everybody else. So
Yeah.
she carries that with her at all times, but that's what she chooses for people to perceive her as. So yeah, she struggles with that. But then when they need her at the law library, she's the first person they go to
Right.
contact.
You
So,
get Nancy. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have a final question.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm wondering if there's any, they expressed any interest in outside support, and if so, what that would look like.
Oh yeah. That's part of the collective efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
So the lifers group is always inviting people into meetings and to meet with them and discuss things and hear with them. They're bringing Jeff Irwin in next 2 weeks, I think they told me. And so that's been a constant cycle. They have, they've formed themselves into different committees that has, so for example, one of the women on the battered women's, what do they call it? It's
Battered women syndrome.
yeah, it's the syndrome, but the committee has another name,
Okay.
but that's the topic. But they have written laws to send into the legislature to ask them to adopt those and move them through the system. And they've done research in other states about how does this get handled. Same with medical commutations. And so they're also frequently writing people all over the country and all over the state to try to address some of the issues. So yeah, they're actively engaged. Is that it?
Many thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.